The year was 1894 when Chicago police entered a structure later called the Murder Castle. Inside, they found shifting walls, hidden chutes leading to a cellar, and chemicals capable of erasing nearly all traces of evidence. The building was a maze of hallways, some ending abruptly. Certain rooms contained vents where gases could be released. In the basement, investigators uncovered eerie discoveries, an operating table marked by signs of unusual use. Worse still, they found a rack-like device linked to rumors of unusual experiments. These shocking sights revealed the atrocities of a man known as Henry Howard Holmes. A figure compared to a villain from nightmares, Holmes became infamous as one of America's most sinister killers, and this is how his dark story unfolded. Holmes wasn't his real name. He adopted it later to conceal his reputation. He had been born Herman Webster Mudgett on May 16, 1861. He was the third child of Levi Horton Mudgett and Theodate Page Price, English immigrants in New Hampshire. A gifted student, he earned a place at the respected Phillips Exeter Academy, then worked briefly as a teacher. He married young and soon had a child. On the surface, his life seemed set for stability in the American middle class. But darkness began to intrude. At age 18, already with a wife and child, he enrolled at the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery. He eventually graduated and was often described as a gifted student, though with some unusual tendencies. While studying in the anatomy department, he began drifting into dishonest activities. These schemes were fairly simple, though unsettling. His position in the anatomy department granted him access to cadavers meant for dissection. On certain occasions, he secretly removed some of those bodies and altered them to appear as though the individuals had died in unfortunate accidents. Before carrying out this deception, the young student had taken out insurance policies in their names. One might assume this kind of plan would be impossible to achieve, even at that time, yet reports suggest he managed to perform the trick more than once. With money coming in, along with a wife and young child, it appeared he had stability, but he showed little interest in remaining tied down. Without much warning, he abandoned his family, leaving them behind, and they would not see him again for many years. Before leaving, he crafted a very exaggerated story that he expected would eventually reach his family. They were told by others that he had supposedly been in a train accident and suffered memory loss. As unbelievable as it sounds, the story was convincing enough, and fabrications like this would serve him again in later years. He eventually traveled to New York State, where his name was linked to the unexplained disappearance of a young boy. Was he responsible? Some believe he may have been, though certainty has never been established. Around this time, he also attempted to defraud an insurance company of $20,000 by presenting another cadaver connected to a false policy. But this particular plan led to him being exposed. His reputation was now becoming widely recognized, and so, in an effort to reshape his image, Herman Webster Mudgett adopted the new name H. H. Holmes. It was around this time that he relocated to Chicago, the city where his name would ultimately be etched into history. He entered into another marriage, despite never officially ending his previous one, and began devising new schemes for financial gain. He had carefully chosen to marry into a family with wealth. Well-educated, articulate, and persuasive, he carried himself with the charm that allowed him to secure loans for purchasing properties. To manage repayments, he would take out additional loans on the properties he already controlled. Eventually, he took on more debt than he could realistically handle, but whenever creditors pursued him, he always seemed able to talk his way out of the situation. One method was to move frequently, avoiding pressure for a time. This eventually brought him to one of the most infamous addresses in crime history, the corner of 63rd and Wallace Streets. There, he first worked as a clerk in a drugstore located on the ground floor. With strategic maneuvering, he managed to gain control of the business, and not long after, he expanded into much of the building itself. The structure was enormous, with rows of shops on the first level and apartments on the third. The second floor, however, was where Holmes constructed his unsettling maze of rooms, and beneath it all, the basement concealed even darker secrets. He continued running schemes, selling from his drugstore so-called miracle tonics that were said to stop alcoholism completely. He convinced a Canadian man to purchase an invention for $2,000, though the gas-producing machine was not what he had claimed. He also marketed water that he promised could cure nearly any illness, though in reality it was regular water he had diverted from the city mains. It's fair to say he understood industrial piping extremely well, a skill that would later serve him in disturbing ways. Holmes also kept modifying his building, explaining to locals that he was preparing a hotel for visitors to the upcoming World's Fair. The truth was that he was constructing a massive structure that defied logic. He would hire contractors only to dismiss them before projects were finished. What he left behind was a house filled with countless doors, stairways, and oddly arranged rooms that looked unlike anything most people had ever encountered. You could walk down one hallway only for it to end abruptly, while some rooms had no doors and others were fitted with trapdoors. How did he avoid paying all the workers who helped construct this unusual building? His solution was constant deception. He fabricated stories, and when those failed, he simply changed the names listed on property documents. Imaginary individuals appeared to own the site, along with a company that existed only on paper. At one stage, even his mother-in-law's name was attached to the property. Around this time, Holmes began to take lives within the building. One victim was his assistant Julia, who was married with a child when she first began working in the drugstore. She later entered into a relationship with Holmes, which led her husband to leave. Not long after, Julia and her young daughter disappeared, and from that point forward, they were never seen again. There were also other women Holmes became involved with, unknown to his wife since she did not reside in the building with him. He could meet someone casually on the street, charm them with his persuasive manner, and before long they might find themselves staying in one of the strange rooms on the second floor. Holmes had picked up various tricks while overseeing construction. He installed alarms throughout the structure so that when a door opened or a certain step was pressed, a bell would ring in his quarters, letting him know when someone was moving about. Many of the rooms could only be locked from the outside, and reports claim some of these spaces were designed to fill with dangerous gas, leaving occupants unable to escape. Accounts also suggest that one chamber, built with fireproof walls, became the site of a fatal incident involving flames. Other rooms, once sealed, held little ventilation, and people inside might have lost their lives from suffocation. Some chambers were connected to chutes that led directly to the basement, while others had small lifts. On occasion, it was said Holmes simply locked doors and left individuals trapped, with dehydration or hunger eventually claiming them. Years afterward, he reportedly confessed to starving a woman in such a space. When remains finally reached the basement and the dissecting table, Holmes would carry out his grim procedures. Because of his background in medicine, he was well aware that organs and certain body parts carried high value and were often in demand. He would take what he wanted from remains and dispose of the rest by placing them into vats containing lime or acid. Some accounts even suggest he may have gone further in ways too unsettling to imagine. Surely, it seems, someone must have grown suspicious of him. This was a man with countless secrets hidden away, perhaps both in the figurative sense and in a more literal way. But first, it's important to know that during this period, Holmes crossed paths in Chicago with a man named Benjamin F. Pitezel. Pitezel himself was no stranger to questionable dealings, though it remains uncertain whether the two ever truly became partners in crime. Holmes also met and later married a woman named Minnie Williams. By this point, he was already tied to two other women, making Minnie his third wife, and eventually there would even be a fourth. After the marriage, he persuaded Williams to transfer the deed of her property to a man who turned out to be just another one of Holmes's aliases. That deed would later be reassigned to someone else, another false identity, this time belonging to Pitezel, and if that sounds suspicious, it certainly was. Minnie's sister Annie traveled to Chicago to meet her sibling and her enigmatic new husband, but after arriving, neither woman was ever seen again. Some believe both sisters may have lost their lives and had their remains misused. To cover his actions, Holmes sent a letter to the women's aunt, signing Annie's name, claiming everything was fine and that the sisters were soon heading to Europe. There was, however, a genuine letter written earlier by Annie to Minnie. In it, Annie mentioned meeting a man named Harry Gordon, whom she described as attractive, wealthy, and very intelligent. Later, Holmes would tell investigators that Minnie had taken Annie's life after they quarreled over him, but most consider this explanation improbable. What is certain is that Holmes maintained many relationships during those years, including some involving the 150 young women employed by him. It is also true that when the World's Fair opened in Chicago, the city saw a noticeable rise in missing persons reports, further complicating the already mysterious events surrounding Holmes and his infamous property. By 1893, Holmes's carefully crafted life began to unravel. He had deceived too many creditors, and several of them were now pursuing him. In response, he attempted to collect on an insurance policy for a fire in his building, a blaze he had reportedly started himself. Authorities were already aware of his growing reputation, and one investigator, F.G. Cowie, began looking into Holmes's past. Cowie's assessment was that something seemed deeply troubling about this seemingly refined and educated man. By 1894, Holmes had left Chicago altogether, relocating instead to the property he had acquired through deception from the Williams sisters. While living there, Holmes was arrested for attempting yet another fraudulent scheme. During his time in jail, he shared with another inmate a plan to take out a life insurance policy on himself and then stage his own death. He asked the man for assistance, promising him a share of the payout if it succeeded. In the end, the attempt failed, and the fellow prisoner never received any reward. Following this, Holmes turned once more to Petitzel for help. He suggested that Petitzel should fake his own death. According to the plan, Holmes would invent a character named B.F. Perry, an inventor who was actually Petitzel under a false identity. Perry was supposed to perish in a laboratory accident, with the authorities being presented a cadaver that Holmes had secretly obtained. Afterward, both men would collect on the policy. But Holmes, true to form, had no intention of sharing. He ultimately appeared at Petitzel's home, incapacitated him with chloroform, and staged his passing by setting the body aflame to resemble a tragic explosion. Holmes then successfully claimed the life insurance, since the policy had been taken out on Petitzel himself. Afterward, he went to see Mrs. Petitzel and explained that her husband was away in London on business. He offered to assist with caring for her 5 children, and on that very day, he departed with 3 of them. Tragically, those children were never seen again. Holmes later claimed he had forced 2 of the children into a large trunk, where he created an opening and directed gas inside through a hose. Before long, investigators were actively searching for Holmes as well as the 3 missing youngsters. Authorities eventually discovered the remains of the girls at the residence where Holmes had been staying. While in the chimney, they found evidence connected to the boy. At this stage, the investigation was closing in and his activities were about to be exposed. Detectives began examining his past in greater detail, and it quickly became clear that numerous people had vanished after becoming associated with Holmes. The scope of disappearances now pointed towards something far larger than a few isolated incidents, and the pressure on him increased dramatically. Investigators then went back to the castle, where they uncovered disturbing evidence of what had taken place inside. Among the items found was what resembled a rack, leading some to believe Holmes might have used it to pressure people into giving him information. Others thought it was tied to an unusual idea he had been working on. Holmes had written about a theory that by gradually stretching the human frame, a person could eventually grow taller. He even speculated this could create a race of giants. Whether or not he ever attempted such experiments on anyone will never truly be known. On October 28, 1895, Holmes represented himself in court at the start of his trial, showing a surprising knowledge of legal procedures. Much about his actions and motives remains uncertain even today. Some estimates suggest as many as 200 victims, though the verified number is 9. He admitted to 27, but his reputation for dishonesty leaves many questions unanswered. On May 7, 1896, Holmes faced execution by hanging. Reports say he appeared composed in his final moments. The process did not end instantly, and movement was observed for several minutes before he was officially declared dead around 20 minutes later. Before his passing, Holmes made a request regarding his burial. He asked to be placed deep under concrete, fearing that after his death, someone might attempt to take his body and sell parts of it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on what's next. See you in the next one.